Thank you all for coming. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Cameron Homeyer of the School of Meteorology at the University of Oklahoma. He completed his undergraduate and graduate degrees in meteorology and atmospheric science at Texas A&M, and prior to his arrival at OU, he spent 2 years here at NCAR as an ASP postdoctoral fellow. Professor Homeyer's research lies within two broad areas, upper troposphere and lower stratosphere studies, and radar and satellite meteorology. Much of his and his group's work during the past decade has focused primarily on stratosphere-troposphere exchange in convection and secondarily on radar and satellite characteristics of tropopause-overshooting convection and severe storms from large 10-year-plus data records. Today, he will be talking about recent insights into cross-tropopause air transport and stratospheric hydration by mid-latitude overshooting convection. Before starting, I'd like to remind people following online that you can enter your questions in the space below the video at any time. And at the end of the presentation, I will read those questions to Cameron. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So it's been about 10 years since I left NCAR, and I've been at University of Oklahoma that entire time. Much of this work on mid-latitude overshooting convection that I'm going to talk about today started as a postdoc here at NCAR, and I've just kept on looking at this problem ever since. So thank you all for inviting me to be here. Before I get too deep into this, I just need to acknowledge up front that none of this work would have been possible without the support from many different groups of individuals. Most of the work here has benefited from extensive contributions or leadership by my group. This includes students and postdocs at the University of Oklahoma. I have two of them with me here this week at NCAR. And of course, numerous contributions from colleagues in the community, including many people in this room over the years. Every bit of this research requires external support, most of it anyway, some internal support from my institution, but a lot of support from NASA and NSF and some support from NOAA over the years on these projects. So for context, I know many of you in this room are likely familiar with the concept of overshooting convection, but I just want to talk about this briefly on what this implies. So we talk about overshooting convection broadly. Overshooting is really any extension of a convective core above its broader anvil cloud. Now, it's not always representing storms that are reaching the stratosphere. In that case, we look for cases where the anvil is approximately at the environmental tropopause height. And in that case, the overshooting tops we expect to be impacting the lower stratosphere. And if you're looking for these things from the ground, you usually have a difficult time because of the perspective. The anvils can get really large. Can't always see the convective cores. But if you happen to be in an aircraft looking at one of these storms, like this picture here on the left, you can see these overshooting tops very nicely. You're often flying above them, most of the time not through them, not intentionally anyway. And then on the right, you can look at these things and see them all over the place from satellite these days. We have very high resolution satellite imagery that is really excellent to look at overshooting tops. You'll notice them as these really highly textured regions where at sunset you get shadowing effects. You see some of these shadows extending towards the east from these overshoots because they're reaching altitudes much higher than the broader anvil regions. So why do we care about overshooting convection, particularly in the mid-latitudes, which is where I focus on this problem? These are often the same storms in mid-latitudes that produce the severe weather that we experience at the Earth's surface. And there's a lot of groups that look into these problems. And with the advent of high resolution, both spatially and temporally, imagery from satellite these days, interest in overshooting top characteristics has elevated again. From my perspective and my group's perspective, we focus primarily on the second bullet here, impacts to upper troposphere and lower stratosphere composition. And this happens both via air transport and ice that gets lofted in these storms that can potentially hydrate the stratosphere. And there's been a lot of varied attention on this particular problem over the years, and I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that we've been doing in the past decade or so. Point that's been brought up several times over the past decade is this idea of hydration from convection potentially facilitating this ozone destruction, rapid ozone destruction in the stratosphere. And there have been a number of studies discussing this, both as a potential mechanism and then attempting to evaluate the potential for this mechanism with models. And there have been some observational pursuits of looking at this problem in recent years as well. And for me personally, anytime I work on a problem, I get really excited about problems that are understudied. And this is certainly one of those areas that for a long time has been understudied. And that for me gets me excited about it because I have a lot of room to explore on this topic. So as I mentioned, we primarily focus on this second bullet point. And we focus on this because it's in this broad realm of what we call stratosphere-troposphere exchange. So this is just transport of air and other material across the tropopause, which has an impact on greenhouse gases and ultimately radiative forcing of the climate system. Oftentimes when we look at stratosphere-troposphere exchange, we're really interested in impacts to ozone and water vapor because these are really strong greenhouse gases in this region, and they happen to be very sensitive in terms of their radiative forcing to small changes in the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere. And there's a whole range of large-scale and small-scale processes that contribute to stratosphere-troposphere exchange. And I really like this schematic from Laura Pan's paper in BAMS back in 2010. You can see midlatitude convection is this little storm up here on the right-hand side of this graphic. And this green dashed line represents the average tropopause height. And you see these storms impinge upon the tropopause region and can exchange air across the tropopause. Now, when we think about these problems, we often focus on impacts to the lowermost stratosphere, which is this lower part of the stratosphere, dark blue here at higher latitudes, that lies below tropical tropopause heights but above extratropical tropopause heights. So it's in the stratosphere at extratropics, and that region is in the troposphere and the tropics. And this is where a lot of the action happens for cross-tropopause transport is in this layer. However, if you happen to be able to reach above the top of this layer, which we typically identify with the 380 Kelvin potential temperature isosurface, then we call that the stratospheric overworld, and the processes that have impacts on the overworld can last much longer in terms of how they imprint on the stratosphere. So we're also interested in whether or not these storms are really reaching deeply into the overworld or if it's just a lowermost stratosphere problem. So that's important. I'm going to call back to that a little bit later. So when I started working on this as a postdoc back in CAR roughly 10 years ago, I was a baby. That's me down there. Whenever I looked at the literature on midlatitude overshooting convection, what I found was that there were a handful of aircraft observations and modeling experiments that basically had demonstrated very clearly that transport in both directions across the tropopause in these storms was possible and influential and potentially significant. But most of the other things that we would care to know about this problem, I list a handful here, I would say were not well known. We had a number of gaps in these areas, and that includes the mechanisms that are really driving irreversible exchange in these storms. We had a sort of early understanding of some of that at those days, and that's improved a lot now. How often overshooting occurred, and relatedly, how often stratosphere-troposphere exchange occurred, because just because you reach up to the tropopause and even potentially across the environmental tropopause height doesn't mean that you actually do anything lasting to the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere. So these are both related, but not necessarily joint problems. And so because of that aspect, we didn't know how much depth, magnitude, frequency of stratosphere-troposphere exchange is occurring in these storms. And we also didn't have much of an appreciation on the extent of environmental constraints that impact overshooting behavior, and then also storm constraints in that as well. And of course, we had no idea what was happening with these storms in response to a changing climate. And since that time, today, I would say that most of these things are moving into that upper category of becoming well-known. I think, yeah, we still know a lot about TST and STT happening in these storms, transport across tropopause in both directions. But we learned a lot about mechanisms responsible for exchange, how often overshooting occurs, environmental constraints that occur in them. There's refinement needed in many of these areas, but I'd say we know quite a bit today compared to what we knew 10 years ago. But we're still kind of on the cusp of understanding the impacts in terms of stratosphere-troposphere exchange and a response to a changing climate, which has still not received much attention. And of course, this is what I look like now, but you can just look at me on the podium It's the same thing. Didn't really need a picture. But. So how do we get here? This talk today, I want to be somewhat of a retrospective, looking back at these 10 years, efforts that my group has done contributing to this problem, but also really important efforts from other groups that I'd like to highlight here. Certainly not comprehensive. If you've done something on this problem, I left you off of this, it's not because I don't like you or anything, it's just because I chose a few examples to really highlight some of these points. So I'm going to talk about these 5 areas. The first of which is one that I think my group has spent a lot of time trying to understand because we've been looking a lot at satellite and radar observations of these storms. But there are visual indicators of overshooting and exchange happening in these storms that we can see from satellite. So I'm going to talk about what we've learned about that. I'm going to talk about mechanisms responsible for driving irreversible exchange and changing UTLS composition. I'm going to talk about how often overshooting occurs, both regionally and globally, discuss briefly environmental constraints, and then talk about recent developments on our understanding of depth, magnitude, and frequency of composition change in these storms. So what we use to study this problem is really a wide range of tools and data sets. That includes, as I mentioned before, modern satellite imagery. We tend to focus a lot on 1-minute imagery from the geostationary satellites these days. I do a lot with radar observations, leveraging the national network of radars to look at the 3-dimensional extent of storms, and we do a lot of overshooting climatology work over the United States with that data. We also use numerical models. WRF and CM1, products of NCAR here, are very vital to these experiments. That includes real simulations and idealized simulations to understand process and impact. And then, of course, we use quite a bit of aircraft and balloon observations in this work, and these days focused heavily on a recent field campaign that I was fortunate to participate very heavily in. All right, so first and foremost, visual indicators of overshooting and stratosphere-troposphere exchange. What we've grown to appreciate here over the past 10 years is the importance of a cloud top feature known as the above-anvil cirrus plume. Okay, and this is not a new discovery. This has been around for a long time. In fact, Ted Fujita did a number of studies on this particular characterization many years ago. And in the 1970s, he was flying around on an aircraft supported by NASA to go take a bunch of pretty pictures of the tops of thunderstorms, trying to help bridge between what the satellite was seeing and what was going on down at the surface. And he had lots of really elegant discussions of dynamics occurring in these storms, and I'm sure he had the time of his life. Sounds like a great way to spend a summer. But he had a lot of examples like this, where he's flying above the anvil of these strong, severe storms over the United States, seeing these really pronounced overshooting top features, lots of wave activity, and ultimately these cases where the overshoots would go up and down, they'd wreak all this havoc on dynamics in this region, and ultimately leave behind this really long trail of ice particles and being advected away from the overshoot downstream. And that's what we call this above-anvil cirrus plume now. So because it resembles a chimney plume coming out of, in this case, overshooting tops. And these great 1-minute imagery loops that we get these days, we can look at storm tops like this, see all these overshooting features here, and see these really smooth plume features that extend. You can see this broad plume feature here well downstream, and at sunset you see shadowing even around these plume features over the broader anvil. And this may represent injection of a really large amount of ice into the stratosphere. So we tried to understand in what cases do these plumes actually tell us it's a stratospheric feature. So a recent study by one of my former graduate students, Elisa Murillo, who is a postdoc here at NCAR now, working with Gretchen Mullendor and M-Cubed. She did a really nice study looking at hundreds of these plume-producing storms from modern satellite imagery. And the question that we were trying to answer here was, what is driving the temperature presentation of these plumes? Because a lot of times we see pictures like this on the left, where this is a visible image up top again. This is now an IR image on the bottom, so cloud top temperature effectively. And you see the plume, in this case, was encircled by this dashed black line. is much warmer than the underlying anvil. In this particular case on the left, we'd call that a warm plume. But on the right, we have cases like this where we've got similarly apparent visible plumes, but they're colder than the underlying anvil. And so Elisa looked at all these cases, looked at radar observations, satellite observations, environmental characteristics, and basically what came out extremely clear in this analysis was that if the plume is warm, it's been injected in the stratosphere. The temperature typically increases several degrees in a shallow layer above the tropopause and the midlatitudes, and when that ice gets up there, it emits at those warmer stratospheric temperatures, and you get this warm plume signal. So that we have a very confident understanding now that that is a stratospheric feature. The cold plumes, on the other hand, are in the upper troposphere, and these commonly occur in really high tropopause altitude environments where the storms still reach high, but they don't quite overshoot the tropopause as much, and these plumes are just residing in the upper troposphere. So that's a nice short and sweet paper, I'd say, on this analysis, and it's very clear. So we've learned a lot about that. And these plumes themselves tie in to one of these mechanisms that we've grown to understand quite well, and that is what is generally understood as gravity wave breaking early on, but has now matured a bit in the context of these really pronounced plume features. So Pao Wang, University of Wisconsin, ran some of the earliest simulations of overshooting storms to study cloud top features like this, really looking for these plumes of ice that were being injected into the stratosphere. And in this 2003 paper, it's the first in a long series of papers that he had done, he demonstrated very clearly that this was the result of gravity wave breaking near the overshooting top in these simulations. And you see examples of these things in these simulations, and the color fill here is just relative humidity with respect to ice. So you see these plume features tied to gravity wave breaking. In 2016, 2017, I wanted to look at this problem from an observational perspective to see if we could further demonstrate this relationship. And we looked at a lot of observed radar cases of these events and looked at their environmental conditions and found that in the plume-producing storms, they had much larger storm relative wind in the lower stratosphere, which was what you would expect to be responsible for gravity wave breaking and ultimately plume formation. That's the critical point for these gravity waves. If the storm relative wind exceeds the phase speed of the wave, then you get wave breaking. And what we found in this case is that when we see storm relative winds, generally in excess of 15 meters per second, as when we get into this mode of frequent gravity wave breaking and plume formation. And we took the observational differences there in the wind profiles and ran simulations where the thermodynamics were equivalent, and all we did was change the lower stratospheric wind, and we verified that when you have strong storm relative winds, you turn on this plume formation, and when they're not there, it doesn't occur. So the storm relative wind, the environmental constraint here, has a big impact on how strongly the overshoots themselves may be irreversibly mixed into the stratosphere in these events. More recently, Morgan O'Neill at Stanford had a really nice study where very, very high resolution simulations of storms with the same general setup that we had in the 2017 paper, and demonstrated with these 50-meter cubic simulations that dynamically this gravity wave breaking, this persistent gravity wave breaking, was really the establishment of a hydraulic jump in these storms. So gravity wave breaking is, part of what a hydraulic jump accomplishes in these cases, but that's really the underlying dynamic mechanism driving these plumes, and it's really driven by that storm relative wind in this case. Now the storms themselves can amplify pre-existing environmental condition so that storm relative wind allows this critical point to be met, but it is largely an environmental constraint, so I'll come back to that later. Now that's for upward transport, injecting things into the stratosphere. Back in the time when I was a postdoc here, Laura Pan led this really nice study on the DC3 observations where we happened to fly over a mesoscale convective system and see a whole lot of stratospheric air flowing down around the anvil edge of these storms. So this graphic on the top is showing ozone observations, the curtain of ozone observations from the airborne LIDAR On the bottom is depolarization ratio from that LiDAR, so the white on the bottom tells you where the cloud boundary is. And on the top, you see all this really red, high ozone air coming down around the anvil edge of this storm. And this anvil wrapping, as was coined in this 2014 paper, was really pronounced downward transport process that we saw not only on this flight where we had these really unequivocal demonstration of this process, saw it in many other flights in DC-3. And we've been able to simulate this. And I had a former PhD student, Dan Phoenix, who was trying to understand the mechanisms driving this anvil wrapping process, was really interested in this problem, came here as a graduate visitor and worked with Mary Barth and Stan Trier here at NCAR to study this process, and revealed through these simulations of that DC-3 case that this is really the result of combination of mass continuity, a shallow mass continuity circulation, and differential advection. So this large mesoscale convective system puts this perturbation high pressure at the tropopause. That leads divergence and ultimately descent out at the anvil edges. That carries that high ozone air down, and then a differential advection because of the outflow. The anvils of this storm leads to that overturning and wrapping at the anvil edges. Now the model doesn't quite capture this process as well as what we, to the extent which we see it in the observations. But we haven't seen this in simulations of isolated storms or other complexes. It seems like there's a minimum scale that a storm has to reach before this process really turns on. But it happens frequently on mesoscale convective systems. So that's what I had on mechanisms I wanted to talk about. Much of our activities otherwise have been really focused on trying to figure out how often storms are overshooting the tropopause. So I mentioned we use a lot of radar observations. This is a study where we're leveraging all those radar observations over the United States and combining it with tropopause altitudes from a reanalysis to determine whether or not storms are overshooting. And then we count up how many times that occurs throughout the years. And we get maps, density plots with lots of overshoots like this. And ultimately, what I wanted to show from this graphic is that all of these colored points show the maximum potential temperature at that location that an overshoot reached. And on the right, this shows a vertical distribution of the frequency of overshoots by potential temperature. And the really surprising outcome from this study, from my perspective, was that nearly half of overshooting storms over the United States are reaching above the 380 Kelvin surface, so into the stratospheric overworld. And that was not something that we expected to see. We also didn't expect to see quite as many overshoots as we did see, about 100,000 a year. And that's, it's a lot more than I would have anticipated going into this. So this started to get us more and more interested about the potential significance of this problem on a regional scale and potentially global scale. And Chuntao Liu, who spends lots of visits here at NCAR, many of you probably had many interactions with him over the years. He's been looking, his group has been looking at this problem with the new GPM observations. I mean, it's not new anymore, but in the past decade, it's a new instrument. And this study, Liu et al. 2020, Chuntao is led by his former PhD student, Nana Liu. They looked at the occurrence of overshoots from GPM records. This is 4 years of GPM data. And the great thing about GPM compared to the former satellite-based radar platform TRIM is that now we get coverage in the midlatitudes. And the really big result from this and a former paper that they published on the first year of observations is that there's a whole lot of overshooting in midlatitudes that was not appreciated up until GPM was in orbit and taking these observations. So our appreciation for the frequency and spatial extent of overshooting convection in the midlatitudes has been growing year after year with these measurements. And you'll notice that North America, where we focus our attention with the ground-based radar network, happens to be one of the biggest signals globally of overshooting. And South America is also very, very frequent. So this is just the frequency of storms reaching the tropopause, lapse rate tropopause in this case. They also look at the frequency of storms reaching the 380 Kelvin level. And again, there, a lot of the other mid-latitude convection outside of the Americas goes away. It doesn't quite reach as deep, but North America and South America still stand out globally as really pronounced signals of very deep, high altitude reaching thunderstorms. So we've got a very growing appreciation of the potential impacts of mid-latitude overshooting convection on the stratosphere, not just the lowermost stratosphere, but the overworld. And this has really motivated the attention towards field projects. And I'm going to end this talk in a little bit talking about a field project that I participated in called DCOTSS, and that was really built upon this growing understanding of mid-latitude overshooting that you see here. So as I mentioned before, I could probably go through 20 different papers to help talk about environmental and storm constraints on overshooting that we've grown to appreciate. And there are lots of different ways to look at this, but this is one of those areas where I thought better to summarize these things briefly on a slide and explain what this means than to take another hour to sit here and go through all these things with you. I've already mentioned this sensitivity to storm relative flow in the lower stratosphere. This is a really important constraint for that dynamic mechanism of irreversible exchange in the stratosphere from overshooting. That's gravity wave breaking. So when an overshoot reaches into the stratosphere, if you got strong enough storm relative winds, that's telling you you've got a supportive environment for gravity wave breaking. So that's a really, really important constraint that we know quite well. And storms themselves can introduce this constraint even if it's not a prevailing constraint in the environment. And this Dow et al. Papers, I thought it was a very interesting paper demonstrating that aspect. So it's happening even in cases where you don't have a pre-existing environmental factor. Lower stratospheric stability. We found that this also has an impact. In fact, if you have a lower stability in your stratosphere, or weaker stability, that facilitates deeper overshooting. This isn't really a surprise. You can go back to SKU-T diagnosis. You're accumulating less negative buoyancy. You're not slowing down your overshooting air masses as quickly. They reach higher altitudes, and that's a constraint. Based on what we've looked at otherwise, it doesn't seem like it has much of an impact in terms of facilitating more transport, but the overshoots get deeper. Temperature is an important constraint, and this is really well known in the tropics, where people are looking at stratospheric entry, water, Brut-Opson circulation, and so forth. Temperature is a really, really important constraint for stratospheric water vapor. Well, a lot of these overshoots, even in the mid-latitudes, can get quite cold, and that limits the amount of water vapor that can exist in those air masses, and it's an important constraint on the delivery of water to the stratosphere. So temperature is important. When the tropopause is lower, it's less of a constraint, of course, lower and warmer, but it is an important constraint, even in mid-latitudes. Tropopause height is another constraint. If the tropopause is lower in altitude, it's easier to overshoot. You take the same storm, put it in 2 different latitudes, it looks really cool. If you're interested in the stratosphere, if you're at higher latitudes, you put it in the tropics and you're like, it's just a normal day, not a big thing. So tropopause height is one of those, type things, but we've grown to really, really appreciate how that has an impact on the distribution and frequency of overshoots. And this last one really isn't a constraint per se, but I'd say it's a challenge. From my perspective, looking at this problem, observations and models simulating these storms, there is no real tropopause definition in a convective core that's hitting the tropopause. Everything is getting, messed up, impacted by this storm. Dynamics get really complicated. You can't use PV because it's getting created and destroyed all the time. You can't use something like lapse rate tropopause because you get really wacky stability things. You can't use pretty much any tropopause constraint that you might apply at large scales. These things break down because it doesn't really exist. So how we go about this problem is we kind of ignore the active period and we really try to focus on what remains after everything settles down. And we look at those environmental conditions. For the climatology, counting how often storms are overshooting, we use that environmental tropopause condition, and we just assume that if the storm's reaching or exceeding that, it's doing something to the stratosphere, and we call that overshooting. But within the context of the convective core, there is no tropopause. And there's a couple studies that demonstrate some of these challenges. And then the storm itself over time does elevate the tropopause in the mid-latitudes by as much as 1 kilometer. And that can reduce the amount of exchange that can take place as time goes on in these storms. So that's what I want to say about environmental constraints. And so to move forward here, I want to talk about what what we've learned about the depth, magnitude, and frequency of composition change, because this varied from many different data sources, but there's a lot of things to appreciate here. From satellite observations, a really well-used tool has been the microwave limb sounder. And this is well used, not because of its resolution, because it's coarse relative to the scales of convection, but because of the sampling. You get thousands of profiles a day, really good near global coverage, and you have a really long record. Now, extending well over 15 or 20 years record of observations from this microwave limb sounder. And so you can do a lot of things that other data sets just don't allow you to do. Has its limitations, but it does have those unique strengths. And there have been several studies. This one by Frank Werner in 2020 is the second out of the MLS group. Michael Schwartz wrote a paper in 2013 looking at this with a shorter record. It shows a similar picture. I'm just showing the more completed statistics from the Werner example here. But you see two regions at higher altitudes. This is 100 hectopascals pressure level, the exceedances of 8 ppm in water. So 100 hectopascals, that's really above the lowermost stratosphere in the extratropics, but near tropical tropopause. And it's a good way to take a single level and ensure you're sort of at or above the tropopause globally. And this is where a lot of prior studies focus their attention, is on these high levels. And so you see two regions that really dominate this picture. Asia monsoon region, where you get lots of exceedances in the summertime there, and over North America, similarly, North American monsoon and central plains of the United States, convection there, that can drive a lot of these exceedances. You also see a lesser frequency maximum over South America, where we also saw that frequent overshooting region there. But these three domains stand out. Now, we have combined our radar observations with MLS over this North America region to try to look at the convective signal in multiple trace gases. And we do that with a trajectory model. So we look where we have storms, we track those volumes with trajectories, and we look at every MLS profile, all the trajectories that go to that profile, and whether or not those trajectories are coming from regions recently impacted by storms of the United States, or whether they went over the United States and did not encounter a storm. And we look at the differences between those two bins of data set with some important controls. And so Emily Tenney, she's here in the audience today, she led this study back in 2021, looking at MLS observations. And I'm showing the changes in water vapor on the left and in ozone on the right, and tropopause relative coordinates projected back using the mean tropopause altitude for environments that we would call extratropical, so low tropopause heights, or tropical, high tropopause heights. And we see in these regions that storms that are reaching up here in the stratosphere are increasing water, which is what we expect to see. So this was a good validation of this exercise, that we're seeing something that we would expect to see in this data set. And it's, in many cases, doubling water in this region. Some really extreme examples, these distributions to the right, and some that are not a lot different. These light blue and red color fills are mapping out the uncertainties in these measurements, so you know when these distributions far exceed those uncertainties that it's a pronounced signal. We see that temperature constraint playing a role here when we look in these more high altitude environments. The water deltas are not quite as high, and we expect that's driven or constrained primarily by cooler tropopause temperatures in these cases. Ozone is interesting because we see these ozone decreases in the stratosphere. And this is interesting because it comes back to this point of, well, we're thinking about air transport. We do expect ozone decreases from air transport across the tropopause, but there's also this potential mechanism for ozone depletion. And we see slightly larger ozone reductions in these more high altitude tropical environments that have been more the focus of this potential ozone depletion. So we see those signals as well. And we look at a couple other things in this paper. We also have been doing a lot of high-resolution numerical model simulations of these events. And Dan Phoenix, the sort of final product of his work, he did the ozone, the anvil wrapping, process mechanism analysis before. But he also did these week-long simulations of overshooting storms of the United States. We validated these simulations with the radar observations, and then we looked at the impacts. The differences, again, between the convective convectively influenced air masses and those that were not influenced by convection. And what I'm showing here are these changes. I'm not going to talk about ozone and CO on the right, just water vapor on the left. Changes between, when you have convective influence in lapse rate tropopause relative altitude, that's the vertical coordinate here, been by tropopause height on the bottom. And again, these model simulations, you aggregate a whole bunch of overshooting during these periods. You see that when the tropopause is low, you get much larger water deltas in the stratosphere than when it's high. And again, that temperature constraint is kind of coming through in the observations, coming through in the models. We see this time and time again. But perhaps the more interesting thing to me was that these simulations suggested that active periods of convection can double lower stratospheric water mass over the United States. And these are not particularly anomalous weeks of active convection.
Yeah. Is this model with chemistry?
This is WRF Chem, yeah. It's WRF Chemistry. Yeah, but even though it's a doubling over the United States, that's still only 1% of the total northern hemisphere area. So,
but it seems
yeah.
that in the stratosphere, where you have the highest water difference, you don't have the highest ozone difference. They don't seem to be correlated.
Yeah, that's right. And
Interesting.
that's an important point. So, yeah, we often don't have a correlation there, and that's because of this difference between air mass transport and water delivery. Water is highly delivered by ice in these storms. And what we see in the simulations is that the water impacts often extend much deeper than the air mass impacts. Air mass impacts are usually within a kilometer or so of the tropopause, while the water impacts can be several kilometers above the tropopause. So, and we'll see that again from field observations here in a minute. All right, so I'm going to try to not take too long, get these last couple things in before I talk about DCOTSS. Another recent simulation was by Andrea Gordon, another student that I got with me this week, and she was looking at idealized simulations of storms. Here, we're only changing stratospheric characteristics again, so equivalent thermodynamic forcing for these storms, same equal intensity storms as far as the troposphere is concerned. We're just changing stratospheric stability or stratospheric winds. And again, I mentioned before, we change stratospheric stability, you get deeper overshoots, but transport doesn't change all that much. But that stratospheric wind change that either facilitates above naval cirrus plume formation on the left or does not on the right has an impact on transport, not only the delivery of things to the stratosphere, but we found that the downward transport changed in this. So this was a really interesting result that I wanted to highlight here. So this vertical line at about 50 minutes, that's the time when the storm first began to overshoot the environmental tropopause, which is right here at 12 kilometers, that thick horizontal black line. And then so after that time, it's persistently overshooting. And what I'm showing here in the red color fill is an overworld stratosphere tracer that we had in the model. So it's just a passive tracer in CM1, initialized at potential temperatures of 380 Kelvin or higher. And we saw in the plume simulation that there was quite a bit more overworld air transported down into the lowermost stratosphere. And this happens to be the result of coupling between the establishment of that hydraulic jump, that sort of standing, braking gravity wave, and the mechanical oscillation forced by this just routine, repeated overshooting of the tropopause. Those two things work together to really, really stir up the lower stratosphere there. So we thought that was really interesting. But it turns out that even if we mix more down the lowermost stratosphere, the plume simulations don't carry that down below the tropopause as much. The non-plume storms carry more across the tropopause. So you see this color fill extend a bit more down across the tropopause. If you look at a full stratospheric tracer, not just the overworld only, it's even more obvious. But yeah, the non-plume storms are doing more downward transport, and the above naval cirrus plume storms are stirring things up more within the stratosphere. So that takes me to highlighting some recent airborne observations and then talking about the big extensive field project that we just carried out. So in 2017, Jessica Smith had this very nice paper on a Seekers event where we targeted convection. And I think one really surprising outcome of this flight was how much stratospheric water vapor was enhanced in the stratosphere up to potential temperatures exceeding 410 Kelvin, so very deeply from a strong overshooting complex in Wisconsin on this flight. So this really extensive study very clearly demonstrates connection between the storms and these water enhancements and was a primary motivator for studying these storms more, in addition to the context that we know they're happening very, very frequently over North America. And seeing these types of signals over Europe as well. And this recent ballooning campaign called MOSES over Eastern Europe, and this nice study by Kordakova documents sampling of this convective plume that they had repeatedly with several balloons. This is just one balloon on the left in pressure, altitude coordinates, and on the right in potential temperature. And you see there's a lot going on here. I just want you to focus on these boxes. This red and black lines are showing the water perturbation, and the blue lines are showing the ozone perturbation. And I found this particular observation to be quite interesting because you see this ozone enhancement that's displaced at slightly lower altitudes to water. So we're seeing maybe evidence of some of this vertical mixing within the stratosphere in these convective events that is having an impact here that we're seeing in these individual cases.
Can I,
Yeah.
ozone increase there?
Why was it increasing? Yeah, so it's either that air's been carried down, or there's also the potential that a large-scale filament was commingled with this convective event in this particular case. And they talk about that in the paper, but yeah, it's somewhat uncertain, but yeah. Okay, so that brings me to trying to wrap this up. Where do we go from here? So as I mentioned before, in my perspective, there are two areas that need quite a bit more attention. First is really understanding composition impacts from convection in the UTLS, and the second is this response to a changing climate. And I say thankfully we are on the cusp of really making a lot of progress on this first bullet now, because we have a lot of really fantastic, extensive field campaign observations from recently completed DCOTSS and ACLIP campaigns, and that MOSES ballooning campaign in Europe, as well as Cirrus high latitude campaign that they had some nice cases from, and upcoming Phileas campaign, which is out of Alaska here next month. And these campaigns are really going to provide unprecedented observations for us to really make vast improvements on this. So as I mentioned before, I've been heavily involved in DCOTSS. So DCOTSS is Dynamics and Chemistry of the Summer Stratosphere field campaign. It's a NASA-supported campaign. We had 2 deployments in the summers of 2021 and 2022, delayed because of COVID, but we completed 23 research flights between those 2 campaigns, and then also collected science quality data on the transit flights to and from Palmdale. So plane is usually housed here in Palmdale at the flight facility there in Palmdale. And then we spent most of our time out of Salina, Kansas, and flew all over the place. So this is showing all of our flights from 2021 in blue and 2022 in red. And in 2022, we also did a few research flights out of Palmdale. So you see we're going all over the place doing various things. But most of what we were doing here was chasing outflow from overshooting convection. And there was plenty of overshooting to chase. 2021, we had a lot of high plains overshooting. This is late summer deployment, usually past the peak in annual frequency of overshooting. And it's mainly over high latitude in the United States and over the Sierra Madre in Mexico during that time of year. And then in 2022, we went out mid-May to mid-July. So this is right during the climatological peak in overshooting frequency. And you see, there's a lot more. And these 2 years were actually slightly below average, but pretty comparable to long-term climatology. So I'm going to show one big campaign-wide data analysis, but I just want to list a few bullets from my perspective of some notable accomplishments that we've appreciated this far. And there's lots of groups working on these things, and papers are going to be starting to come out left and right, I'm sure, in the next couple of years. But first and foremost, we were quite successful at targeting these air masses. From my my accounting, we collected more than 20 times of all available observations within overshoot material that existed prior to this mission. And just to give you a numeric value, we spent more than 28 hours within overshoot air during the campaign. And we flew for maybe about 7 days worth of time. So a good chunk of our flight time was spent within these air masses. In addition to that, we comprehensively sampled a wide range of environments: more tropical high-altitude tropopause environments, mid-latitude environments, and covered the full extent of the North American monsoon anticyclone. We did reinforce the model result that water vapor impacts extend much deeper in the stratosphere than air transport impacts. And we sampled even some active convection events, including bisecting above ample cirrus plume producing storm. And Andrea talked about that earlier in the week, as she's been leading the analysis of that particular case. But it's really, really great observations from this campaign. I will say that so far we've found limited evidence for this ozone depletion process. I think this is because the conditions that are required for that to happen are really only possible in a narrow zone, and we didn't have that many samples in that zone in the first year. We had more in the second year, and so far I don't think we've seen much in the way of depletion, at least the events that we flew. But almost every stratospheric volume that we went to go sample that we knew, because of our trajectory forecasting, should be connected with recent overshooting storms, we found water. It was hydrated. So I think that's particularly notable. So there's empirical evidence that pretty much any volume of stratospheric air reached by convection is getting hydrated to some extent. And we broke existing records for the depth of stratospheric hydration driven by convection. And that occurred on this flight last summer. Big, strong supercell in Kansas reached altitudes of 19, 20 kilometers based on our radar and satellite analyses. And we found water up to 19.25 kilometers, 4 kilometers above the tropopause. Potential temperature of 463 Kelvin. It's high. And ozone concentration of 1,552 parts per billion. So very, very deep in the stratosphere. And that's here on this graph. So on the left, distribution of all these water vapor observations at potential temperature. The gray colors are the background observations, so anything that was not connected to storms via our trajectory matching. And all the blue, these are regions where there were perturbations above background on that flight that were linked to convection via these trajectory calculations. And these guys are all the way up here, 450 to 463 Kelvin. That's from that record-breaking flight. You can also look at this in tropopause relative altitude coordinates on the right, and you see similar distribution, but up to about 4 kilometers above tropopause, we're seeing substantial water deltas. Okay, and then really briefly, Emily already showed this on Tuesday, so if you're at that talk, this will be a repeat. But as far as I know, as far as we know, this is the first attempt to ever look at how storms are changing in response to a changing climate. So we're leveraging an existing database. Emily's leading this work. Leverage this existing database of a 12-year WRF simulation over North America that is in the NCAR RDA. So this has been around for a few years. And it's what's called a pseudo-global warming experiment. So you take a control period driven by reanalysis, in this case era interim. It's supposed to represent all the storms that should have occurred during that period. And then for the pseudo-global warming experiment, you add all of the projected climate changes from the CMIP suites of large-scale climate models. So that's three-dimensional changes in temperature, humidity, winds, et cetera. You add those to that historical field and then see the response in the system. And there have been similar experiments just doing downscaling with future climate runs to capture just all the changes in dynamics and so forth on some large-scale patterns. And I'd say generally what's been done with this and what's been done with those other downscaling experiments is showing a similar result. You're getting more intense convection. And in this case, what Emily has found, she's processed the first 6 years of this, is that you get a lot more overshooting too. So the control experiment, this is just with the historical observations, you get an overshooting distribution that looks really, really close to what we get from our radar climatology. In fact, the numbers are almost equivalent. I mean, some slight spatial deviations, but ultimately this pattern is consistent. But when you add that climate forcing, you get more than a doubling of overshooting frequency over this region. So it's just really enriching the available instability in the troposphere and leading to more overshooting events in this experiment. All right, so to wrap this up, hopefully I've demonstrated my group spent a long time in the past decade pursuing increased understanding of mid-latitude overshooting convection. I think we've published almost 20 papers on these topics. We've developed an appreciation for these differences between water delivery and air transport, mostly up to this point from our modeling experiments, but that's coming through and being confirmed by our our new aircraft observations. And while we have learned a lot, we're on the cusp of answering a lot of really important questions about stratosphere-troposphere exchange and how these storms might respond to a changing climate, which I think are getting towards the bigger end scale of these questions. And just to maybe excite or interest you all into looking into this problem, I'm going to just throw up three what I would call outstanding big questions. First and foremost, how much of stratospheric water vapor is sourced by mid-latitude overshooting convection? Past efforts to do this budget analysis with models often only consider the effect of tropical convection. By and large, almost all of them only consider the effect of tropical convection. But we know that mid-latitude overshooting convection is more frequent, just in a tropopause relative sense. Maybe not always as high of altitudes, absolute altitudes or potential temperatures, but it's more frequent. So how much of the total lower stratospheric water is sourced? Because the radiative sensitivity to water change is greatest in the lowermost stratosphere, in the mid-latitudes. So these storms may be having a larger impact than we might expect. What constraining processes? I talked about some of these constraints and sensitivities. What's dominating the water delivery? Because some of them enhance water delivery and some of them limit it. So what's actually active in a typical convective scenario? That's really important to providing good estimates of these water delivery. And then how is overshooting going to change in a warming climate? There's so much that we can do with this problem. We're just starting with a data set that we have access to that do lots of other experiments. And I'm excited to see what people start to do on this. So thank you very much for your time. Happy to take questions.
Are there questions from the audience?
Okay. Can you explain what the importance of the hydraulic jump is? I don't really understand what that is, and it seems important. I know that paper generated a lot of interest, but can you explain that?
Yeah, it did. So I mean, hydraulic jump, you get this supercritical flow downstream. It's related to obstacles. So you get the supercritical flow downstream of an overshoot. It's really ultimately a response to this really strong flow going around it. It accelerates on the tail end of the overshoot here, and then leads to this major instability. And ultimately facilitates just this standing breaking gravity waves.
So it
Yeah.
increases turbulence.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's a very sort of.
Some criteria, and once it turns on, it just makes a lot of turbulence.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Please use the microphone. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your really exciting talk. I have really two questions. Number one, can you think also about what happens with nitrogen oxides? Because you have a lot of production probably into lightning, and there should be perhaps some intrusion also into the stratosphere through those mechanisms. And when I saw your maximum ozone just below the water enhancement, I was thinking maybe that could be a production due to enhanced nitrogen oxide there. So do you have any feeling about, of course, maybe the NOx might be converted quickly to HNO3 or nitrate and so on, but that was my first question. Second question is, in the past, a lot of people were talking also about dehydration due to the cloud. And so there is, of course, enhanced water, but a bit outside the plume, is there a compensating mechanism? You showed some of that. That would dehydrate maybe on a rather broader area?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for the nitrous oxides, we had NO2 measurements and DCOTSS, and we rarely saw enhancements in the stratosphere in these plumes. In fact, we rarely saw much else except for water vapor perturbations. There's a handful of flights where we saw substantial air mass transport, and what it seems, to me at least, to imply is that the cases where we did see more air mass transport, these were really enormous convective clusters. So really broad, large area, many, many updrafts and overshooting in these regions. When you had that, you had some air mass transport, but when you had more discrete, even if it was a really strong overshooting storm, pretty much the only thing we saw was water. And the water signal is much larger just generally. But yeah, we did not see much nitrogen oxides above the tropopause. So that was somewhat of a surprise because we expected to see more. As far as the ozone changes, yeah, I don't know if it's some of this competing process that some of these overshoots are doing that stirring and bringing some higher ozone down while the air transport is decreasing it too. But that's a good question on how much of it is really driven by chemistry versus transport. And then the second question was the dehydration. Yeah, so former studies on that were really focused on tropopause reaching storms in the tropics because of the temperature constraints there. But if you look at that literature, the dehydration is really occurring at and below the tropopause. If you look above a lapse rate tropopause, so some of this was in the context of TTL, water vapor concentrations. So a lot of that is below a prevailing lapse rate tropopause condition. So in that case, there was dehydration below the lapse rate tropopause, but it's always hydration above the tropopause. The modeling studies, the aircraft observations, it's always a net positive water perturbation when you get above because the temperatures in a relative sense are warmer. Yeah, you're welcome.
Very interesting talk on dynamics and kinematics. Mm-hmm. The thing you haven't mentioned at all is that these overshooting tops are also sources of very prolific lightning. Mm-hmm. And that probably varies from storm to storm, which if you looked at, perhaps it would just be another parameter to help you with understanding when it's important. Because I could imagine, for example, in storms where you're producing slightly larger particles, grapple, that you might have more lightning, whereas others you don't. Yeah. And also going back to Guy's talk or comment with regard NOx production, I mean, the type of lightning you have is curved. I mean, what we see from the overshooting tops is very short but highly, very large number of lightning flashes or discharges. I wouldn't call them flashes.
Sure.
So again, motivation to look at that because you don't mention that at all.
Yeah.
You've got experts on lightning very near you there with the Oklahoma LMA as well as now the GLM.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we do. That's
something I think is worth looking at.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And there's been only a couple of studies that I've seen on that, dominate this frequency maximum in overshoots. And it's not clear to me whether it's always there or how often it is there. The context lightning for me has just always been kind of a little bit farther outside of the reach of most of the questions that I'm asking, though it's relevant in the context of
maybe
NOx.
So. You're sort of suggesting
that
lightning isn't important to this.
Yeah.
But if you look at it, then you can really say that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
So this is probably an obvious question, but are the mountains responsible for the regions that we see with the most events? I mean, is that why we're, the mountain ranges that?
Yeah, somewhat indirectly. Yeah, but it's all connected, right? All the, the plains, the central plains, in fact, of the United States, it's driven by the coupling of, we got this great mountain range that cuts off a lot of flow from the west, and we get the low-level jet that forms and carries up a lot of moisture from the Gulf and the central plains, and it provides these conditions that ultimately build up plenty of convective instability that then, leads to these overshooting events when the storms do initiate and form. So yes, they're part of the whole puzzle.
Yeah, I know that region in Argentina is always very active, right? And a lot of people go there to study it. But
right, yeah.
Are there any other questions from the room or online? No. Let's thank Cameron again for a great talk.
Thank you.